Hey everyone. All right, while we're waiting for quorum, I've got one topic that's been requested for today, which is the revisit our terminology. Does anyone else have any other topics to propose? And we can go back, we can continue the dash discussion um, and the integration with dash.
Hello, this is Don, just joining.
Hey. Yeah, the good news is, from my point of view, the working groups are addressing the correct topics, and they're well attended, and they have good presentations. I attend as many of those as I can, and so I think um, we're digging in the right place in most cases, so that's good. Uh, and I know Sridhar will not be joining us today. Um, he has a personal matter. All right, it's 5 after. Let's go ahead and get started. So in February, we had a discussion on terminology, and but it's one of the trickier discussions we have that doesn't have to do with technology in and of itself. Um, so, and it's the DPU, IPU, XPU terminology question. Um, the so one of the things that happened to prompt that discussion was SNIA adopted DPU as a term. we'd actually been using XPU in the network storage forum, but the SNIA, what's now the DPU SIG, and the SNIA technical board decided that DPU was the best term. Another thing that's tricky is, unless we keep using XPU in the code, what do we use in the code as the terminology, right? So, something like DPU underscore IPU would be tricky to use. On the other hand, for OPI, we've mostly left in the either XPU or DPU slash IPU terminology so far, right? We haven't really gone and made wholesale changes. So it's not like we acted heavily on the topic. And I know on the forming of OPI, we decided that DPU slash IPU would go into our technical documentation, our website, our marketing material. Okay, so let's open this up again, because I understand it's actually a complicated topic. It seems like it ought to be simple, but it's not. So we'll start with so Dan, yeah, you'll go ahead, but I just want to check with Paul to make sure I didn't miss anything from the history as he recalls it.
No, I believe that's the history. We did talk about, so we did talk about it in a TSC meeting, I remember. We came to the conclusion that DPU was probably best, but we didn't have everybody in that TSC meeting. So
yeah, I think
the suggestion was to create a PR and discuss it in that PR. And I don't think that ever happened.
Right. And, to be fair, I think we were caught on Kyle's transition at that point. And so we need a lot more input from Intel. Like I said, we didn't act on it fully. So Dan, go ahead and give us your thoughts and perspective. And if you have any proposal, positive stuff, positive proposal or negative proposal or any kind of proposal to resolve this, I'll listen to anything.
Yeah. No worries at all. Yeah. I think that the position from Intel hasn't changed. Is that, we started OPI precisely because we have these different devices that are fundamentally different, and so that a DPU and an IPU from our perspective are not the same thing. And the differences are significant enough that we need an initiative like OPI to help customers buy into a single customers, users, developers, buy into a single ecosystem as opposed to something that's specific to a particular device. So that positioning hasn't changed. And I think that if we were to go and change all the code, change all the content to pick one over the other, I think it would have unintended optics problems, right? So let's say we say, all right, we're going to go to the SmartNIC Summit in a couple weeks, and you know what? We're going to stop saying the word IPU, and we're just going to say DPU, all of our presentations, all of our documents. And what people will take away from that is, it doesn't matter how much explaining we do. They'll say, oh, wow, so Intel really isn't doing OPI anymore, or, oh, wow, Intel has, gotten themselves kicked out of OPI, or Intel, are you going to change your marketing now to DPU because, OPI is not talking about IPUs anymore. So, and you can sort of explain that, like, hey, it's a pain in the butt to like DPU slash IPU, like keystrokes, like this is terrible, like programmers hate this. We can explain this up and down, but the perception will still be there that, oh, wow, no more IPU, right? So, when people only have a certain amount of time, things can get awfully petty. So I think my alternative proposal will be pretty simple, is that we did create OPI to bridge these differences, right? So instead of saying, hey, we're just not going to recognize some of the differences, and we want a name that's shorter, why don't we just do the George Foreman and name it after ourselves? When we're talking about something that's we're programming through an OPI API, or we're provisioning using an OPI mechanism, call it an OPI device. Call it an OPI target. I think that, and I think in some of the documentation we've been using those types of terms. It is kind of weird. Like, I don't call my server a CPU, right? There's a bunch of stuff on that server. Sonic and Dash talk about the smart switch. That smart switch could be implemented with a DPU, IPU, FPGA, or a giant monolithic ASIC. Like, who cares? So my recommendation would be for this, and I'm happy to participate in this markdown that we still need to write, is to say, we are bridging the differences through all of these different types of devices that are sometimes called different things and have different behavior. We're going to bridge them through OPI. And when we're sort of talking about the thing that we're addressing in OPI, we're going to call it an OPI device or an OPI target or whatever name we decide. And that's my recommendation.
Okay, so, all right, so what we did before, I believe, and correct me if I'm having a moment this morning, is we use the term XPU in the code as the kind of umbrella term in the code, and in all of our documentation, where we needed such a term, and in comments and documentation and content, we used DPU/IPU is what we had decided on. Is my memory and understanding correct there?
It depends. I don't think that any of our contributions use XPU.
Okay.
I think we actually got flagged a couple times by having the word IPU kind of sneak into the code, and we're sort of slapped on the wrist. And so we usually would change the code to be more descriptive.
What did you use
not
instead?
specific.
What did you use instead for the stuff that's already there?
I need to look. I guess first off, in IPDK, there is no there are no functions called IPU because
okay.
None of the code is target agnostic code. So, and then I think in the VPN submission, there was a time where the word IPU came up. I don't know if it was documentation or not. Boris would know, but Boris said, "Hey, I don't want you to use IPU here." And so I think they changed it to something generic. So I think that, if we had a style guide that said, hey, we use DPU, IPU in our when we're talking about the different types of devices we support. And inside the code, we need to make sure that the code is target agnostic, right? So the code should not be invoking a set IPU MAC address or whatever it is, because, you don't know if you're acting on an IPU or a DPU or some other device. So I think that the code needs to be target agnostic until you get to the very, very bowels of the device. So I think that if we are using something that is DPU, XPU, IPU, it's probably not descriptive enough inside the code, and you should use something different to say. And if we do have this new term like OPI target, then or OPI device, then you can just say device as opposed to IPU, DPU.
Dan, I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
Yep. I was going to do one more thing is that we actually have a rule in the IPDK submissions. So you can't use the word IPU. That otherwise you've broken the abstraction. You've, we just did a big, we have a big PR open to submit a bunch of changes for the E2100, and kind of going through. Sometimes people mess up, but the maintainers are going through and making sure that you didn't anything above the TDI. You're not invoking something that is specific to that device. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Vipin.
Yeah. So Dan, I had a question, and this is not going to argue the terminology used, but I was just curious. The term infrastructure processing unit came from the fact that this unit or this particular device, not device, the chip here we are talking about. So I agree that we need to separate chip from the card, because it's not that we don't call server a CPU. It's a perfect terminology to say that we need to have two different terms for these two. But I'm curious, you call it infrastructure because what was the thought behind calling it infrastructure? Is it because infrastructure is owned by some kind of cloud provider and everything else is non-infrastructure? I'm just curious behind the use of the term. Is it mostly applicable to cloud domain, or is it applicable to some other domains as well? I'm just curious on the origin of this term infrastructure, and if it was specific to a domain versus if I were to use it in an appliance, would you still call it infrastructure, for example?
Yeah, we do. The term infrastructure came from, infrastructure as a service, where they were saying, all right, well, networking, storage, crypto, different types of things that someone in a cloud may use. But then those same cloud principles are applied at the edge. They're applied in enterprise. Someone running an enterprise can sometimes look a lot like a private cloud. So, we use that infrastructure term to sort of say, hey, it's sort of all the things that are running, behind the curtains, helping you get what you want to get done, and you sort of take them for granted. So, and for that reason, there's different security, there's different control plane considerations that are there by default in an IPU. That I don't think would make sense for a device that was just doing data processing, right? So if it's just doing data processing, it could be thought of as a data coprocessor, right, to a CPU. It could, and so for these reasons, we have a different name. I mean, and an IPU can run standalone. It doesn't have to, it's not a always a coprocessor to a CPU. So that's why the name exists, and I think we've all commiserated how we didn't. None of us, Rob or Kyle or myself, named it IPU. I understand it's good to make that distinction, but it causes these different issues, and unless Intel marketing goes and changes their terminology to DPU or some other term, I don't think we want to. We want a signal from OPI that it's just too hard to type these 7 characters. So let's just drop half of it. I think that's just not the right signal.
Okay. So Vipin, anything else?
No. I just had one follow-up, and I think my understanding of why is it called infrastructure is very accurate from what you described. Then the follow-up question is, if it were to be used as a coprocessor of a CPU for data acceleration and data processing, not really the infrastructure work that comes in the context of building either cloud on-prem or or telco infrastructure. I mean, on-prem, public, or telco infrastructure, but it does, let's say, get embedded in, let's say, a storage appliance to accelerate something which is working very much in tandem with the CPU as its co-processor. And there are use cases like that. So would you still want to call IPU in that case from the use case point of view?
Yeah, we actually wouldn't. Yeah. So our ASICs and our FPGA IPUs are sometimes used in different environments, and in those environments we don't call them IPUs.
Got it.
I don't think that we call them DPUs, but accelerator, NIC, these types of names are used instead when it's especially if it's being used as a peripheral. Then we that trusts the host. Then we will not call it an IPU when that's the case.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
I'll just comment that I don't think the name data processing unit implies that it can only be a coprocessor or must be a coprocessor to CPU. That's just my personal opinion.
Oh, I agree with that as well. But I think that there was also the motivation of IPU was that at the time there were more than one DPU out there, and they were pretty different, and so it was hard to tell exactly what you were getting based on that term. It wasn't like a CPU where you kind of, maybe the instructions were different, features were different, but you knew what you were getting into. In the case of DPU, there was a lot of variation, so it wasn't clear exactly what it was, and so that was another motivation. Whether that's warranted or not, I won't sign up for that, but that was another motivation.
Yeah. Okay. So, this is always a tricky topic. I've been through this discussion in various forums, probably 10 times over the last year and a half or 2 years. And it's always tricky. And it's tricky because of the way this class of device grew up out of what was there before. So there were things that looked very much like DPUs, at least back to the mid 2000s. So 10, 15 years, 15 years ago. And you can argue that old school single board computers were essentially doing the job of what DPUs did. So if they sat in KMAC or Fastbus or VME crates, and you put a set of them in, and they had, basically you had a little bit of chassis management and power. That looks a lot like what we had before. And in the early 2000s, intelligent switches were all the rage. And what they look like is a DPU sitting in front of a switching element. And so the concepts of specialized elements that process data or support infrastructure, to be fair, have been around forever. Okay. What Intel has for IPUs are DPUs by the broad definition of DPU that SNIA has ended up with, and most of the industry has adopted. And I've given that presentation 10 times over the last year, and I've never gotten any pushback like, oh, that's a terrible definition. And the components that are on the Intel IPUs match exactly. Now, when I give the definition, I always broaden it out so that control plane offload and service support for processes running on a switch or independent operation are all included in the definition. But remember, we're playing a little bit of semantic games here, right? So, the industry
So,
yeah, go ahead.
I would say, the presentation where you say that has not gone over well internally with Intel, but we just I think that everyone should
Well-
be given, their space to
Okay, so
present
let's-
their
okay,
perspective.
let's break that down a little bit. So
Yeah.
what makes an IPU, okay, you know what's on, okay, again, we have to be a little bit careful in the discussion in that we're a, inclusive, vendor neutral organization, just like SNEA is, but we have to have this discussion. So what distinguishes an IPU from, let's say, an NVIDIA, a Marvell, or a AMD, or Fungible, or one of the startups DPUs? So what is the distinguishing thing that's like, this makes it an IPU? Because I've never been clear on that. From a functional role, I get why that is an okay name. And I mean, we could have called these things single board computers, and we would have been actually probably been just as happy if we went real old school to the 90s, because these are single board computers. I mean, I used to work on these in the 90s, running VxWorks, version 2 point something and version 3, and hard real time, and man, that was a beautiful environment to work in if you wanted things to go fast, and you could cut your own coding toes off in an instant, and you'd be like, hey, how come nothing's happening anymore? But so Dan, what is the distinguishing feature other than functional positioning and marketing for an IPU? Because I haven't been able to come up with one.
Oh, there are several. And I think that in the beginning, we did go through a lot of these differences. That a lot of it has to do around with security and control plane assumptions when you turn that system on. But I don't really want to drag into that. I think there are two issues here. Like, you bring up CPU, and CPU is actually a terrible example, right? Because there was no organization that defined what a CPU was. That never happened, right? What we did was we just you either used x86 or a Motorola, and if it so happened that x86 had a couple different vendors, which I think was by design, and it did quite well until recently. And so I don't think that CPU is a great example of what we're trying to do here. So I think you have to go back to say, we should ask the question, what is OPI supposed to do, right? If OPI is just, I believe that OPI should be, we accept all devices. Intel, I would like to understand why your device is different from these other DPUs. Have that discussion, document it, and then when we write our OPI APIs, we write them in a target agnostic way, such that it shouldn't matter if your hardware architecture or your marketing campaign. If you can support the API that was defined, then we can port to your application, port to your adapter card or your smart switch.
Okay,
So that's what I think we need to go back to.
Yeah,
We need to go back to OPI. What is the abstraction that OPI is providing? And at that point, I strongly believe that we shouldn't go and try to collapse on a single term. We should say, hey, user, you shouldn't even care if what these vendors call it, whether it's x86 or ARM or whatever. You shouldn't care. You have your API, and we're going to ensure that the devices that are supporting that are going to behave in a consistent manner.
Yeah, well, and to be completely fair, CPU, central processing unit, comes from ancient history in the computer world, and it's a completely functional description that has been embedded deep within everyone's consciousness who works on anything, or even the general public. So everyone kind of knows what a CPU is. Peripherals have always been a mixed bag of terminology. So I actually don't mind, personally, I don't mind anybody calling their peripheral with the components anything they want. The question is from the point of view of, and OPI of course wants to have APIs that program anything that has a combination of accelerators and CPU and basically bus and network interfaces, or internal and external interfaces, or even all external interfaces. And to a large extent, these things look like microservers, and they look like old school single board computers to a large extent, just with the way you attach to them and the amount of stuff on there greatly enhanced. So they're all clearly in one class of device. So we're only discussing terminology, and I understand why there's pushback and on the terminology. Okay, so one answer is to leave well enough alone in all of the OPI documentation and basically technical and marketing content that's produced, and use DPU/IPU, DPU itself, IPU itself, sometimes even XPU, just wherever it naturally fits. And for the official kind of OPI stuff, we don't go and make a wholesale change. We just leave it the way it is, which is we use DPU/IPU nearly everywhere. Correct? So that's one thing we could agree on is, look, there's no reason to change any of the collateral that we produce. In terms of the code, I think I quite like your, why is DPU trying to creep into the code itself? Is it some specific model? And then would it split based on whose DPU it is and so on? Because the things that people call DPUs are all very different internally. I mean, I know a lot about the internals of pretty much all the devices that are out there. And while I can't start explaining the differences on this call, I'll say that there's a very large variation in the details of the implementation, in how programmable pipeline there or not there, how it's done, network packet processing and how it's done, the way the packets are sort of directed around internally, the number of cores and how they're used to do the acceleration and control plane offloads and service offloads, etc. Right? So you're right that DPU or IPU should not be creeping into the code very much, and we should police that. We should question hard if those terms creep into the code. Why is that trying to creep into the code, and kick it out in all cases, right? Because there are always ways to write the stuff where you don't need those terminology. And then if it's a comment or description section, it can be DPU/IPU, and again, if it's in the adapter layer where it's specific to a vendor's component, it can use that vendor's terminology. So if there's some lower level model in polymorphism where that thing is going to use explicit terminology, it uses the natural one for that component, which might change over time or even have multiple terms for a single vendor's components. But again, that ought to be isolated down to basically hardware adapter implementations. Does that make sense to everyone? I'm sort of agreeing with you, Dan, that maybe what we do is we basically do nothing. I mean, except now push back harder on, so why do we need the term DPU or IPU in the code at all?
Yeah, I think we still need this markdown that says OPI is target agnostic. It's agnostic to what it is that it's acting upon until you get to that lower level of polymorphism, like you said. And we need to have a coding guideline that's policed by the maintainers that says, hey, if you put call Intel differentiated feature X into the code, I'm going to kick it out. And so I think we've already been doing that a little bit. I think that we just need to have a markdown and make it clear that, you know, OPI is agnostic to your implementation and, you know, wants to make sure that that implementation code is well in the bowels of the layering.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
So
I have a question.
go ahead, Boris.
Sorry, Paul, to interrupt. I don't understand what you guys are talking about. We spinning bunch of containers. Some containers we call host because it's obviously emulating the host. We have some containers that running inside the DPU. What terminology is proposing us not to use DPU? So how we call these containers? Device, agnostic device, general purpose processor, which is not CPU. We need to find a terminology for this.
So Boris, do you have a explicit example of, so you want to, this, you're talking about naming a container that's running some service or application?
For example.
Yeah, good. Yeah, do you have an example?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, good.
We name our containers DPU.
Why?
Because we need to distinguish it between the container which is representing the host. For example, for storage, we deploy container which is emulating host, we deploy container that emulating DPU, and we deploy container that emulating target storage. Same for networking. EVPN gateway that we're currently working on, we have host, we have DPU, and we have the target, the internet. We need to find a name for those containers if we don't want to call them DPUs.
Yeah, so I would recommend that this is where we would, in the markdown, we would say, you know, we don't call it these infrastructure backend services based on DPU or IPU or XPU. Let's give it a different name. Let's come up with a consistent naming mechanism in this markdown for something that is, you know, on the other side of the host. We call it infrastructure. So, and I think for OPI, we can lean in and say, hey, if it's on the infrastructure side, separate from the host, then we would call it infrastructure. Or again, we can always pull the George Foreman and call it OPI.
Let's
But
keep it
either
short
way,
then. So your proposal is to rename DPU to infrastructure? I just want to be clear and short. I don't like long discussions.
No, that way oversimplifies it. I believe that use of DPU in your example is incorrect. I don't think that we should be calling those functions that are separate from the host DPU. That's not right. So we need to come up with a consistent policy within OPI as to what we call the functions that are supporting something on the host.
Well, no,
and programmed through OPI.
we're talking, but again, Boris is bringing up container, saying the names of the containers, not the names of the function. So Boris, how many places do we use the term XPU or DPU inside the code APIs or models themselves?
Now I'll post the link in the chat. You can look. A lot.
Okay.
So this is probably the root of the problem, is that we are no longer agnostic, I suppose. We're making certain assumptions that the non-host components are DPUs, and that's probably not what we want to do in OPI. That's you know, not really going to. I don't think it's a very descriptive term either. You know, we're trying to describe something that is, you know, supporting host functions, or, you know, so calling it a DPU. I mean, it's not even doing data processing, right? If these are containers, then you know, maybe they're running on the cores separate from the host, but I don't think that's necessarily the right term.
Okay, so it's all in. Okay, so it's mostly in comments, although it is. So again, the terminology is mostly in the comments, and then a little bit in the container names, and it's not really that many places. And in some of the readmes and scripts, so it's actually not buried in API definitions to almost any extent.
Yeah, if you search
Yes.
for DPU, you see it quite a bit, 196 times.
Okay.
But I will say that many of those are DPU/IPU. In comments, in code snippets, it's DPU. Like
Okay.
DPU underscore IP, DPU underscore interfaces, DPU host.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. It's okay, so it's not a lot of, you're right, a lot of those are in comments, and it's not completely out of control.
Right.
And in a lot of the comments, it's DPU/IPU.
I don't understand the proposal. Okay, let's say we identify all the places. I'm not okay with Dan Daly suggestion to renaming DPU into infrastructure.
No,
Or
I
IP.
don't like that one either. That
So
was
That's
I
fine.
don't understand what the actual proposal. I may be oversimplifying. I'm very slow and it takes me time to catch up. So bear with
Not
me.
at all, Boris.
Bear
Well,
with
no,
me. I want to understand what we're doing.
So I think that I still go back to I like the idea of a markdown. And I'm happy to volunteer to write this down. Is that we need to pick a name when we are naming things that are not running on the host, that signify that they're not running on the host without calling them DPU, IPU, infrastructure, whatever. Something that is too I don't know, too overloaded. I don't know. So let's what I'll do in the markdown is I'll put my suggestion, which I think we should just use some variant of OPI, some variants that says, this is sort of the in the P4 nomenclature, we would call it a backend. I hate that name. So we've struggled with this a bit in terms of engineers are terrible at naming things, but I'll put something down that doesn't have the word data or infrastructure in it, and we can go back and forth and try to pick a good name. I think that this is important as we start to write more code, that we do so consistently, and with a name that is inclusive and keeps with the original goal of OPI.
Yeah. So Joe, if I could real quick.
yes, sir.
When I talk to other groups, SNIA, SmartNIC Summit, Dash, others in the industry, everybody has, so here's how I hear it described. We're talking about DPUs. Oh, unless you're talking about Intel, they call them IPUs. And it's always that caveat at the end is what, yeah, we're talking about DPUs. Everybody knows they're a DPU. Intel calls them IPUs, so we'll throw that in. And that's the sentiment that I hear, not in code, not in code snippets, nothing like that. But when talking to people who work in this industry, everybody talks about it as though they're DPUs. Oh yeah, Intel marketing wanted to come up with something different, so they call them IPUs. So we throw that in at the end. That's how I hear it talked about. Many of the groups, SmartNIC Summit has decided they're going to call them DPUs. And Dash seems to, in their repos, just call them DPUs.
Yeah. Well, and
I think that's what started this discussion was how do we do that?
And SNIA DPU SIG is the DPU SIG. So
yeah.
Again, SNIA was using the term XPU for a while to try to be inclusive of all the terminology that was out there. And SNIA, the SNIA board decided to collapse on the term DPU. And again, we could have maybe we could have a beer discussion, Dan, on the actual differences, which there are a lot of differences across all the devices, but none of them are material to either the composition of these things or the function of them.
No, I would say it differently. I'd say there are differences, and mostly are vendor specific, implementation details, but they're not significant enough that we couldn't build an OPI API or an OPI platform that bridges all of them.
No,
So
we are. No, so again,
yeah,
the mission of OPI, so all we're really arguing about is terminology and what to do in our code.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think drafting a markdown and editing is great. So continue, Paul. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, and I agree. I think that I wasn't making a suggestion. I was just making an observation as I talk to folks who are not as, they don't understand the differences between these devices, and they're trying to figure out how they're different from a SmartNIC, how they're different from a GPU. What are these things? It lands at DPU in everywhere except Intel's discussion of these devices.
yeah, and I'm happy to bring in into the TSC or in whatever meeting we want, is to go through the differences, whatever teaches the controversy. I'm fine to do that, but like what I was going to say though is that it doesn't matter how many times I give that presentation. The perception is going to stay the way you described it, and so
yeah, exactly.
And that's precisely why we can't go and change it, right? Because that would just reinforce the perception. And
no, I get that,
would
and
likely
I totally understand.
Yeah,
I mean, I like your George Foreman idea. Part of me likes that. Part of me thinks that's a silly thing to do, but part of me likes it. An OPI target device, an OTD. I don't know. We come up with some other 3-letter acronym, which seems silly to me. But when I think so. My suggestion in marketing materials, we continue calling them DPU/IPU. In code, we just call them DPUs, just because that's what it's easy. I don't think people, correct me if I'm wrong, but DPU/IPU is a bad thing in code. Okay,
well,
in comments, bad in
but no,
code.
I don't think we should be calling them DPU or IPU. I don't think that. I think that the code is usually talking about something that's in code. It's not talking about the particular device. And so I think choosing a DPU or an IPU is going to break the abstraction that we're trying to get to. It unless you are in that layer that is specific to the implementation, you shouldn't be calling something. You set up the port, right? You configure the port. You call it DPU_interface. That's wrong. Like, we shouldn't call it that, right? We should call it specific to setting up the port, running the container, right? This is why we need to find an implementation agnostic term that we can all agree upon. Sorry to jump on you there, but like that, this is I think fundamental. Like, I think we can't say in all of our wikis and markdowns that we're supporting DPUs and IPUs, but then when you open up the code, all it says is DPU. We absolutely can't do that. It's broken.
Well, except everyone, so fair point, except that I think everyone in the industry would know exactly what was being talked about, and there would be no, Intel must not be included, because again, if you look over the broad sweep of the industry, SmartNIC is still used sometimes, DPU is used almost everywhere, and then just like Paul said, it's DPU. Oh yeah, and Intel calls them IPUs, but we're talking about the same class of device doing the same kind of functions. Got it. Let's move on and do the useful part of the discussion.
Yep.
But let's find a term that doesn't fall upon that, marketing stupidness, right? Let's find a term that we can all agree upon that, lands outside of that, so that, You say that everyone will know, but you know, I don't agree that that would be well understood. That, oh yeah, no, we still include Intel. We just don't write IPU in the code. I don't think that that is really following the goal of OPI, which is not to be, you know, particular to any implementation or set of implementations. So let's pick a term that is, you know, outside of the whole deal.
Right. So you're okay. So you're going to create a markdown that makes a proposal for how to deal with terminology, essentially the beginnings of a coding style guide. Again, we don't need a heavyweight document, but for this, we do need to resolve it because there's contention. If there's if there's no contention, we do a quick vote and be done with it. But because there's strong contention, we need a proposal that we can then review, and then then if it ends up being, you know, 2 versions of the proposal, we'll put it to a vote. And whatever that is, we'll live with the answer.
Sounds great.
Can we also vote on removing IPU completely and keeping the name DPU? I think that's the simplest proposal. I understand Dan is opposing that, but I think that everybody else agrees on DPU term except Intel. Can that be also a voting thing?
Yeah, we could tee that up for a vote, if you know, if we need to.
I just that would be a big, you know, I wouldn't like it.
Intel would not like that. I get it. And
I was just, you're setting me up to have to go back hat in hand and explain that to people who aren't in this discussion. So just please keep that in mind. Yeah, it would be a difficult discussion that would have serious ramifications beyond just, okay, now the code is just DPU. It's a nuclear option. So you know, oh, it's just a vote and everyone already agrees except for Intel. I don't think it's that simple.
So so Dan, if you could prepare markdown for how to resolve this, then we can contribute, you know, we can comment on it, contribute to it, and if there's a workable answer, then maybe we can resolve it that way. If not, then we'll start making you know, formal motions to vote, and we'll actually record the result of the vote, and you know, we'll make and we'll resolve it that way.
Sounds great.
All right, any other thoughts?
Just one. I'm just real-time thinking here. What about DPU/IPU in marketing materials, DPU/IPU in comments in code, and like DPU_host, like we've got it in actual code snippets? Is that simple enough? Does that cover everybody's needs here?
I mean, so XPU is if you do have to talk about this device, and device is not okay. You know, I think it would be better. Yeah, just talking out loud. Help me with my markdown so I don't get this wrong. I think I just want to get away from PU entirely. Like, you know, my kids laugh every time they hear the word IPU. It's like, really? You know, PU is not great.
Right.
So you know, I think just picking a name, you know, device underscore, you know, is great, right? It's talking about the device, you know, that function could be running on a smart switch, right? Like, you know, if we design it correctly. I think that the device or target is better. than anything, DPU, IPU, infrastructure, data processing related, and that's probably what I'll go with on the markdown. But I'm absolutely open to suggestions. I just think that getting ourselves away from putting this in the code as either a DPU or an IPU or as infrastructure, I think is probably the it's just there's too much history. Obviously this was a real thing when we were formed. So I think that we just need to be aware of that.
Yeah, so if we were on the Supreme Court, you'd be an originalist.
I do like to go back to, hey, what does it mean to be open, programmable, and infrastructure, right?
Mhm.
This is not open DPU, right? We didn't set it up as open DPU, and so we should go back to that when there's attention.
Yeah, no, so all few, I'm just poking you, a little bit of fun, Dan. I apologize. Gentle fun. So I think creating a markdown, solicit direct input from people, nag them if you have to get input where you
Yep.
input and help.
Beforehand. Yep.
Create that markdown file and let's look at it, because maybe there's a simple way out that everybody can go, yeah, that works well enough, and we don't have to dwell on this and spend time on this any longer. And we'll have a policy written down, and we tell her, hey, just go read those paragraphs and bullets and follow that policy, and everyone will be happy, and we're done with it. So let's see if we can resolve it that way. If not, then we'll look at what are our alternatives, and basically draw high contrast alternatives and basically put it to a vote. Okay, but let's see if we can resolve it with a reasonable piece of a style guide to start with, and we'll review that and see where it goes. So when do you think you want to review that? You want to do it next week? Could we do it that soon, since you kind of know everything?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. All right, cool. Okay. Any other final thought? We didn't get to further discussion on Dash and on bringing IPDK components into OPI that could support Dash, and making them more general. I think we need to go back to that discussion. I think there's some useful stuff there. All right. So any last thought from anyone? All right, thank you very much, and we'll continue this next week, and hopefully just resolve it and be done with it forever.
Sounds great.
Later.
Would love that. Okay. Thank you.
Right.
Bye.